Okay, we might start, if that's okay. I think it's always difficult having sessions just before lunch and just after lunch. So we'll try and make this really lively for you. So thank you very much, and I hope you've had an enjoyable, I'm hearing something, an enjoyable lunch. My name's Has Dalal. I'm the Director of the Australian Multicultural Foundation, but also the chair of the Multicultural Framework Review Panel the Minister just briefly mentioned in his presentation. And I'm glad he talked about announcing the $100 million. Now it's gone up to 104 million. I was told 100, now it's 104. So every time a minister speaks, they'll add a few more millions. So I think that's what we need for the framework review. So it's really good to see how they've embraced this recommendations of the review. But we're not here to talk about that right now. So thank you for the invitation and to chair this illustrious panel I have before me. But I begin today acknowledging the traditional custodians, the Ngunnawal people, and certainly a very timely discussion we're about to have. But then when is it never not timely to talk about everything migration and its challenges? And the one thing I know, though, is certainly we do need to raise the standard of migration debate, particularly in this year of democracy. And also, in order to address any emerging issues, we've got to have discussions that are not emotive, divisive, and uninformed. To begin to even address any emerging challenges, and that's what we'll be doing today. We heard a number of comments and issues and challenges that were raised with previous speakers. James, with the Social Cohesion Index, talking about the divisions and voices, diversity, the divisions, intercultural harmony, and this measurement of social cohesion, immigration, the migration review, and how the migration system is broke, and now we're trying to repair it, so the challenges that go with that. So I guess there are a number of issues from a community perspective as well that we need to address, and our next two speakers will be looking at some of those challenges and emerging challenges at that point. We're going to slightly alter the format today. Basically, we have 5 presenters, so how it's going to work is we'll have our first 2 presenters, and then I'll stop it and we'll have Q&A for 15 minutes with the first 2 presenters, and then and then we'll follow on with our other 3 presenters, but there's 2 of them presenting the one presentation, so both will be speaking, and then we'll follow that up with a Q&A as well, a 15-minute Q&A. So let's begin. Our first speaker is Violet Remulitis from the CEO of Settlement Services, and Violet, she has nearly 40 years of experience leading for-purpose organisations that promote equal opportunity and support individuals and families facing inequality. She is the CEO of Settlement Services, which is known as SSI for the last 11 years, and she's expanded that organisation from 68 staff to over 1,200, assisting more than 56,000 people annually across various human services in Australia, which is a great feat. Violet's a former Telstra Businesswoman of the Year, featured in the Australian Financial Review's 100 Women of Influence. She also holds several non-executive roles, including Deputy President of the Australian Council of Social Services and membership on various advisory councils for social issues. I'll also introduce our second speaker as well, and then they'll just follow on rather than going reading straight after. And followed by Violet will be Joseph Laposta. He's been the CEO of Multicultural New South Wales since 2019. He's dedicated to enhancing access and services for new Australians while supporting established communities and preserving their cultures and languages. He has led the implementation of the strategic plan for the 2021-25 and introduced new language services award, expanding a team to 90 full-time staff to over 1,300 interpreters and translators. But also, Joseph is a great sports person, and I didn't know this, but an accomplished pianist. Well, that's terrific. That's really good to know, Joseph. That's wonderful. He's a strong advocate for gender equality. He increased female representation in the senior leadership team from 25% to 60%. So could you please join me in welcoming both of these speakers? Thank you very much. clock's there, 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land we meet on today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and the continuation of cultural, spiritual and educational practices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Well, I'm very honoured to be here today speaking and engaging with all of you on this amazing panel. So I want to acknowledge my fellow panellists. And 40 years, it is a long time. I know, I feel very old. But I have to say, last week I became a grandmother for the first time. So baby Atticus, so thank you. I cannot tell you, everything people say about it is true. My heart is very full, so that's been a lovely thing. So a little bit about SSI. Well, SSI is a national not-for-profit organisation providing life-changing human and social services. With community at the heart of everything we do, our purpose is to help create a more inclusive society in which everyone can meaningfully contribute to social, cultural, civic and economic life. I'm going to focus my remarks today on multiculturalism, more specifically reflecting on the past, but outlining a vision for the future where migration continues to make us stronger as a nation. Central to my presentation is the need for a renewed focus on equality of opportunities and outcomes for newcomers who have already migrated here. It is their efforts, commitment and innovation that helps us to realise the benefits of migration. The Multicultural Framework Review and the government's response is a watershed moment. It offers an opportunity to reset, to rethink the country's approach to migration. And I do want to acknowledge the leadership shown by Hasta Lau, our panel chair, in helping shape the review. In this room at least, we are all probably in strong agreement of the critical importance of migration to Australia's prosperity, society and culture. We also understand the serious risks that come with not getting it right. We know from the annual Scanlon Foundation research and from other sources that multiculturalism has maintained widespread community support for more than 50 years. One of the manifestations of multiculturalism back then was a gradual evolution towards specialised programs and services for multicultural communities. These have often been delivered by multicultural or ethno-specific organisations, including specialised settlement programs for newly arrived refugees. We regularly acknowledge the success of migration and multiculturalism as part of our country's national identity. Yet we often fail to acknowledge the foundations of that success was in part created by those same multicultural and ethno-specific organisations. These were and continue to be an essential element of the social infrastructure to build a more equal, multicultural Australia. As highlighted by the Multicultural Framework Review, investment in these specialised multicultural and ethno-specific responses has waned in recent decades. This led the review to call for a reset of multiculturalism, noting that the Blythe, not working. Oh, I won't go forward, so. Yeah, right button. Okay. The Blythe assertion that Australia is the most successful multicultural society in the world is no longer sufficient. Arguably, the challenges Australia faced during the pandemic brought the real-life consequences of this Blythe assertion to the fore. Insufficient capacities and capabilities result in significant disparities for newcomers. Okay, I'm not having luck with this. All right. Across OECD countries, a comprehensive review of inequalities in outcomes during the pandemic found that higher rates of COVID-19 related deaths among migrants and refugees. Similarly, in Australia, the mortality rate of COVID-19 among people born overseas peaked in 2021 at almost 4 times 4 times higher than people born in Australia. The OECD found an accumulation of risk factors contributed to these outcomes. These included poorer housing, higher rates of job losses, and systemic discrimination. Similarly, the Australian public health system's response to cultural, ethnic and linguistic diversity was called into serious question around the pandemic. An independent review of Australia's response to the pandemic found language barriers that were inadequately addressed at multiple levels contributed to poorer outcomes for newcomers. And this led to public health messaging that was hard to read, difficult to understand, and confusing to action. In essence, the pandemic provided a reminder of the limitations of mainstream responses during a crisis. It also highlighted the arguably lazy thinking that a multicultural Australia that has many strengths would be sufficient to deal with a major crisis. Even as recently as this year, we have seen this same attitude come to bear in the treatment of families fleeing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. A small number of Gazan families have managed to come to Australia, arriving via visitor visas, leaving them ineligible for social support and without work rights and no access to Medicare. Almost a year on, there is still no resolution for these families, many of whom are at risk of homelessness. There has also been no allocation of humanitarian visas to Gazans offshore. Recently, there has even been calls to stop all arrivals from Gaza and baseless claims made about the security risk this cohort presents. The issue with our response to this crisis is not just the lack of humanity, but the inconsistency when compared with responses to recent conflicts in Ukraine and Afghanistan, where Australia quickly stepped up its response to offer safe haven to people already in the country and abroad. This discrepancy demonstrates the risk of having an ad hoc approach to humanitarian crises. We are currently advocating for the creation of an emergency response framework, but in its absence, we can see how a crisis like this exposes the limits of our welcoming multicultural identity. Aside from times of crisis, differences in opportunities and outcomes persist in multicultural Australia, including around employment for migrants and refugees. This occurs at a programmatic level and a systemic level. At programmatic level, there's been long-standing concern about the effectiveness of federally funded employment programs for different cohorts of job seekers, including for migrants and refugees. Often this stems from mainstream programs that fail to adequately address the challenges that they face. These would be familiar to many of you in the audience today and include a bias among employers towards Australian work experience, limited work-ready English language proficiency, a lack of understanding of rights and responsibilities, and experiences of racism and discrimination. Specialist programs bring skills and capabilities that are responsive to the particular needs of disadvantaged cohorts. They can also contribute strongly to co-design through existing links to and knowledge of community needs and preferences and their reach with local diverse communities. SSI brings first-hand experience in co-designing and delivering specialised employment support through the Refugee Employment Support Program, or known as RESP. This innovative program was funded by the New South Wales Government from 2017 to 2024 in recognition of the unique barriers refugees and people seeking asylum face in obtaining sustainable and skilled employment. And I do want to acknowledge both Peter Shergold and Joseph Laposta for their leadership and support for this program. The program worked with local employers, training bodies and other NGOs to connect eligible refugees and people seeking asylum with training, support and jobs. The program employed multicultural employment specialists to provide tailored support based on participant skills, experience and goals. An independent evaluation of RESP found that overall, the program provided an innovative and tailored response to the challenges that refugees and people seeking asylum face in finding employment and overcoming economic exclusion. I want to make the point that probably it's the only program in the world that actually supports asylum seekers into jobs. I don't think there's any other country that has a program like that. It's quite extraordinary. So RESP achieved strong employment outcomes, with more than a quarter of all those who participated in RESP commencing employment during the program. In addition, more than half of the RESP participants who completed a survey for the evaluation were employed, the majority in permanent jobs. So great outcomes. Critically, the evaluation found that RESP exceeded targets. It also offered a better experience for refugees and people seeking asylum than mainstream employment services, including Workforce Australia. So with the state government unable to fund RESP post 30 June this year, and not having any luck in succeeding in securing any funding from the Commonwealth, the 1,200 refugees in the RESP program on 30 June were transferred and transitioned to 4 for-profit providers in southwest Sydney who were deemed equally capable of providing services to this cohort. We also see differences in opportunities and outcomes in employment for migrants and refugees at a systemic level. Here I want to turn my attention to the long-standing issues in having their skills and qualifications recognised. For decades, we've known that the underutilisation of skills and qualifications is a systemic issue, preventing migrants and refugees from participating fully in the workforce. We've known that addressing this mismatch would help solve critical skill shortages. We heard the Minister talk about that earlier. The issue is so widespread that even if this is not our own experience, most of us know someone, a parent, a partner, a sibling, a friend, impacted by this. If I did a show of hands in this room, I'm sure we'd see just how pervasive the issue is. Now, in research launched by SSI in June, we have a more granular understanding of the challenge and opportunity that this presents to Australia. On average, among permanent migrants who arrived in Australia over the last 15 years, 44% are working in occupations below their skills and qualifications. This equates to more than 620,000 permanent residents who are not fully utilising their skills and qualifications. Critically, almost 6 in 10 underutilised migrants in Australia entered via the skilled migration scheme, with a majority of these being migrant women. And as I'm sure many of you in this room know, this underutilisation is not a short-term issue. It persists even after they've been in Australia for more than 10 years. As this slide shows, there is a level of underutilisation in the Australian-born workforce too, but migrants are more likely to be underutilised, equating to just under 150,000 people. The research also quantified the opportunities, showing that $70 billion could be added to the national economy over the next decade if permanent migrants were able to work in jobs that match their skills at the same rate as Australian-born workers. And this benefit is derived from an increase in total employment, more people and hours, increased productivity at an industry level, skills are being used, and a reallocation of labour across industries, more relevant work. Every state and territory would benefit, with the biggest benefits flowing to the jurisdictions with the most new migrants. All of this indicates that Australia has the skills needed to fill critical shortages, but many of these workers are being overlooked. At a time when industries across the country are struggling with the skill shortages, it is more important than ever that we harness that workforce and economic power of those already on our shores. Which brings me to the next steps in this initiative. We already have more than 80 organisations, including unions, employers and community-based organisations supporting this, such as the Brotherhood of St Lawrence, ACOS, IKEA, Australia Post and Unions New South Wales, amongst many. The more awareness we can raise, the greater the impact we can have collectively. We are working hard to engage with governments, industry and unions on practical policy solutions. We are moving from defining the challenge and raising awareness to mobilising communities through a public campaign, focused on one key reform, making overseas skills and qualification recognition simpler to navigate and affordable. To find out more, please visit billiondollarbenefit.org.au, and we'd love your organisations of you to join that campaign with us. So in closing, I want to return to multiculturalism and equality to argue for a renewed focus on these. Firstly, we can do better in Australia, and we should do better. It is possible for us to reimagine ourselves as we did 50 years ago, when multiculturalism reshaped the direction of policy in this country. The Multicultural Framework Review provides strong foundations for how the Australian government resets multicultural policy. This is an invitation we must take up to reimagine ourselves and reshape the direction of policy in this country. By doing so, we will ensure multiculturalism and multicultural policy reflect the Australia of this century and not the last. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Violet, for highlighting clearly a number of those challenges, but more importantly, how to address some of these challenges and some of the initiatives that you pointed out. And I'm sure during the Q&A we'll delve a little bit deeper into that. But certainly I think one of the key takeout for me is we certainly cannot call ourselves the best multicultural nation on earth simply because you are culturally diverse in the absence of any good social policy. And I think that's where, I guess, what we have been working for in the last 50 years through whether it's the national agenda or the new framework review is to ensure that we're not complacent and that our social policy is fit for purpose moving to the future. So thank you for that. Now can I please invite Joe LaPosta. Thank you, Joe.
Thanks, Huss. G'day, everyone. I haven't been under this many lights and cameras since I was on The Price is Right. It was about 2001, I was 19, and at the Channel 9 studios there in Richmond. I'm not even sure if they're still there in Melbourne, but I do remember my most pleasing experience, because I didn't win the showcase, was when my nonna had about 25 Italian grandmothers over to her house in Reservoir to all watch the screen with Larry, the magical Larry, and he's a beautiful man, and me. And one day I hope to be Larry, but I don't think I'll ever get there. But I'm on this panel, so that's pretty exciting. We're on the after lunch shift, as Huss said, is inevitably tough, but I'm going to steer you away from slides and just hopefully to a charismatic and entertaining presentation that addresses some of these things. Part of the oldest continuing living culture on earth is something I really value, and the people at Multicultural New South Wales do too. So I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the lands of the Ngunnawal panel and people, and join the panel and everyone at ANU that's joined in acknowledging them. Who hasn't met Professor Alan Gamlin, who's the director of the ANU Migration Hub? A big thanks to you, Alan. Where is he hiding? There he is. For having us here today. We had the great privilege of having Alan come and talk to, or Professor Gamlin, coming to talk to us as our keynote speaker in our regional summit in Wollongong in June, which feels like just the other day, but it's hard to believe it's actually now spring. Big happy birthday to all fathers, big happy Father's Day to everyone yesterday as well. And Alan came to talk to us and really sort of challenged our team. Whilst the challenge wasn't directed to us, it was directed to the Commonwealth Government. He really challenged our team around that not enough was being done to sort of harness the energies and the efforts of what it was. And to Huss's point before, Alan really asked the question, as Violet did, is being culturally diverse enough in Australia today to classify yourself as a successful multicultural society? And challenge accepted from our team. And we fed a lot into Huss's review, and we work really closely with Violet and others. But I think that's the question that we've all got to ask ourselves, because I think at times right now, I'm sort of getting to the end of my speech, but I think at times right now, our political leaders particularly rest on the laurels of the work that's been done over 50 years, rather than really thinking about the work that needs to be done to nourish and sustain and maintain a multicultural society for the next 50 years. So keep that thread in your mind as I go through today. I'm the current steward of a department called Multicultural New South Wales. So for those that don't know, we've been around 40 odd years. Some of you may remember a guy called Paolo Totaro, who started the Ethnic Affairs Commission in New South Wales. He was then succeeded by a guy called Stepan Kerkasharian, who led the Community Relations Commission, and I now have the privilege of leading Multicultural New South Wales. I've been there since, as Hass said, January 2019. I touch on this because I think it's important. In my first year, in January 2019, 3 seismic events happened that challenged people. The Christchurch attacks in March, the San Diego synagogue bombings that at the time the Jewish community felt that was one of the greatest terrorism attacks in the modern era, triggering lots of really strong emotions from the Holocaust. You know, here you go, you're at a place of faith in worship and you're being bombed and attacked. And then, of course, come Easter, we had the Sri Lankan terror attacks, killing many hundreds of people over Easter. And I've been in my job 3 months. It is impossible to build trust and currency with people in times of crisis. Impossible. It is critical for us as a society to really nourish relationships in peace times, to be thinking when we're safe and comfortable with each other that we're building. It's why it's so difficult right now to be trying to build trust and currency within the community with so many geopolitical issues bubbling concurrently, and I'll touch on them. Our agency, sorry to the Victorians in the room, but our agency was actually the first state in Australia to enshrine multicultural principles, and the second state in the world to enshrine multicultural principles into its legislation. So we've got some pretty proud legislation that sits around us, and almost all of the recommendations from the Australian Multicultural Framework Review that Hassan Nidal and Christine led describe what it is to be in New South Wales right now. To have an agency like mine with the purview and the responsibility reporting directly to the Minister and the Premier on everything multicultural, whether that's from language policy or whether it's to the successful implementation of voluntary assisted dying in our hospital systems. And that's really important because multiculturalism isn't just about a thing. It isn't just about a group of people. It isn't just about an acronym. It's about a whole ecosystem of things that needs to work concurrently to make us thrive and to make us to connect and make us feel a sense of belonging and to want to extend ourselves. Of course, after the 3 initial terrorist attacks, who knows what came at the end of 2019, catastrophic bushfires, followed pretty quickly, I think, by the end of January and February with this really strange virus that was permeating through Iran and northern Italy, a place I can relate to, that then very quickly became a global pandemic, interspersed with catastrophic record floods, interspersed with another, I think they called it Domicron, where our Premier at the time opened up everything, and then we had another wave of COVID, and then dispersed with catastrophic floods. We get to the end of 2022 and starting to think 2023, here we go, fresh start, and then the world flips on its heads with issues like the Middle East and thinking of all the poor people suffering in Gaza, and also thinking of all of the families, and even just this week, the devastation of what's happened to people that have lost loved ones in Israel as well. And then the fact that as a country, we're on a knife's edge at the moment as to whether Israel does invade southern Lebanon or Iran does retaliate. And that will have catastrophic implications for us as a country in terms of potentially welcoming somewhere between 10 and 15,000. For those that remember the experiences of 2006 in terms of Lebanon, we could have a mass migration of people coming to this country under very difficult and dire circumstances, to a state and to a country already at the moment that's got a number of issues, which I'm going to touch on. One of the most challenging things for working in government, put your hand up if you work in government. Oh, good, I have friends. Because often government's the evil big, monolith that controls us all. And then people like Alan, who are smart and intelligent and get to be academics and brew coffee, find ways to criticise us, and then we try and overreact and defend ourselves in pandemics and do a hopeless job, and the cycle goes on and on. Why I tell you this is because one of the things government's really good at is creating acronyms. And one of the acronyms that it has created, which is purely an academic construct, is the reference to the term called. Now we're laughing, yes, but we still use it. And we almost describe a multicultural Australia through the prism of being culturally and linguistically diverse, as if it's some homogenous group of people. You're called, I'm called, you might be called, we're not sure, we need to ask you a few more questions. You're definitely called, right? We're called, so therefore we need to create something for different people. Well, the reality of the situation is difference is mainstream. In New South Wales, more than 1 in 2 of us has a parent born overseas. Almost 1 in 3 of us is now born overseas, And we all saw what happened in the census in 2016. We went from having those very friendly English and New Zealanders as our 1 and 2 countries of migration to Australia, to now having India and China, very different ideals, different faith, different way of life, different relationship with government. Hugely densely populated countries coming to a land of opportunity, bringing so much with them, yet at the same time experiencing so many systemic barriers in Australia in terms of being able to harness and deliver on that potential. Yet government still references diversity as if it's a homogenous group. So one of my great challenges is reminding people that there is diversity in diversity, and that to reference focusing on multicultural communities or multicultural groups is purely just inadequate. That the conversation needs to be nuanced. It needs to be about need. Translating material in the top 5 or 10 languages doesn't tick your multicultural box. It doesn't go anywhere near enough. And we're all in this room thinking, of course, he's stating the bleeding obvious. Yet if I challenge you to go back and talk to the communication directors of some of the biggest departments in the New South Wales and Australian government, they'll tell you that it's impossible to translate into 10 languages because they don't have a budget. And yet it's their obligation to be able to engage with and mirror and support the citizens that they're there paid by to represent. If you live in places like Auburn, more than 60% of households speak a language other than English at home. Parramatta, Cumberland, but this isn't just a Western Sydney thing. If you go to a local government area like Griffith, more than 1 in 4 people in Griffith is born overseas. Almost 1 in 5 in Wagga. Griffith, Wagga, quintessentially Australian towns, the backbone of our country, wheat, wool, Aussies, footy clubs. 20%, 25% now migrants. You go to places like Armidale, fastest growing community is our Yazidi community. And they're making an incredible contribution to regional Australia. They're changing the script. They're taking towns that were potentially in decline to now towns that have got a future and are thriving, that are getting new hospitals, that are getting new schools, that are hopefully getting the investment that we all know that they should deserve. And that's in spite of the fact that we've had a pandemic the last 3 or 4 years. So our migration rates have actually dipped. Yet as a country, where we're heading for 2041 in terms of migration, let me give you some stats. Migrant arrivals increased 74% in 22-23 compared to 21-22, and that's obviously because of the pandemic. New South Wales planning expects that the New South Wales population will increase to almost 10 million people by 2041. It's not that far away, with almost 1 million of them, 950,000, expected through net migration alone. We are getting more diverse, and if we're ever to ensure that we provide the services and support that cultural communities need, indeed that all Australian needs, then our governments collectively, Commonwealth, state, local, must become more culturally aware and culturally competent. And I don't say that lightly. Appreciate the developing language capabilities of many of our new and emerging communities and ensure critical government messaging is translated, or in our case, particularly where you're talking about courts and police, is there with interpreters. And not just your extended family as your interpreter, but a qualified interpreter to help you navigate the justice system, the policing systems and these things. Also, we've got to reflect on the fact and navigate the important intersection of a multicultural society's connection to their respective religious beliefs, whilst maintaining a principle of religious neutrality in a secular country. And I think this is very important. When people from the census were analysed about their connection to faith, the majority of people in, I think, the 2016 and 2021 census that came from mainland China identified their nationality as their primary driver. Yet that script was flipped when we started to talk about India. Yes, they're very proud of the fact that they have an Indian nationality, but they're very proud of the fact that they are a Sikh of Indian nationality, a Jain, a Muslim, a Hindu, a Christian. So understanding the interrelationships and what drives each individual in terms of their identity is equally important. I don't want to go into great depths, but when we did a listening tour recently of our culturally and linguistically diverse communities, Australia, guess what the number one issue they told us was? Cost of living. It wasn't Israel, Gaza. It was exactly what we're all worried about. rising rates of inflation, possibilities of children being able to get education, possibilities of one day owning a house. Is this the last generation of people that can ever afford a house? If you are a teacher, a nurse, a fire person, fiery, an AMBO, a police person, what is the probability of you being able to live in close proximity to your place of work? If you are a teacher at DY, do you need to live in Edmondson Park to get to DY? Do you need to live in Gungahlin? Do you need to live 40 or 50 minutes away from your place of work to be able to get anywhere? And that's the reality, and that's the challenge for us, particularly with both parents, many of them, whether they're same-sex, heterosexual couples, cis couples, whatever. The reality in terms of that distance and that challenge around cost of living is a universal principle. And for us, we know that it disproportionately affects our more vulnerable. And so when Violet's talking to you about our newest Aussies, particularly those that bring torture or trauma-related fear and baggage when they come to Australia, we know that cost of living, particularly accessing to housing and health services and education, which is a primary driver that we need as a country to remain prosperous, is having massive ramifications for us. And so thinking about how we support all people with rising cost of living is a critical element. And then the last thing, because Hass has very politely wrapped me up, is that the days of, and I use my grandparents, my nonna and nonna, and congratulations, yaya, on becoming a yaya, but the days of my grandparents needing Australia's largest satellite dish to be able to consume media from Italy are done. All of us have the ability right now in our hand to consume whatever media source we want. We live in a very, by the term and definition, globalised society. So whilst I'm speaking to the Premier at 11:30 a few weeks ago about what's just happened at a church in Wakeley, the amount of mis and disinformation from far-flung parts of the world trying to unsettle our Islamic community, our Lebanese Christian community, our Melkite community, our Assyrian community, our Chaldean community, to make them feel higher levels of threat and anxiety than they already could have or should have needed to in their homes, was unbelievable. Not a lot of people know, but whilst the New South Wales Police were navigating a riot of 2,500 people in Wakeley, there was 500 young men mobilised at Lebanese Muslim Association at the Lakemba Mosque, fearing their mosque was about to be burnt down to protect them. There was 350 people at the Green Valley Mosque down the road, fearing that they were told their mosque was about to be burnt. So our capacity as a society to remain strong and resilient and connected and deal in facts is more challenging than it's ever been. And that is particularly challenging when you're overlaying geopolitical influences. Some countries and some communities that hate the very essence of our democracy, hate the fact that we're a successful, thriving, multicultural society. They hate it. And yet it's our collective obligation, academia, the non-government sector, the not-for-profit sector, and certainly the government, who does not have all the answers, despite sometimes the hubris feeling it gives you, but to collaborate and to work together. So part of today was just about hopefully lighting a fire in you on one or two of those things. And a big thanks again to Professor Gamlin and to ANU for having us. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, for a very insightful presentation and something where both of our presenters, I think this is fantastic. Thank you very much, which now brings us to our second part. And so please let me introduce you. First of all, there'll be a joint presentation with Michael Copland and also Dr. Leteomio Sawabu. Now, Michael is the Chief Child Protection at UNICEF Pacific Multi-Country Office. He has over 20 years international experience in the development of child protection programming for governments, UN agencies and international NGOs. He has worked with UNICEF as a child protection specialist in Timor-Leste, Uganda, Sri Lanka and East and Southern African Regional Office. And prior to taking up his position with UNICEF in the Pacific, he served as an Executive Director and the Australian National Mental Health Commission. Michael holds a qualification in social work, international law from University of Queensland and University of Melbourne. And Dr. Leteomio Sawabu is an Associate Professor in Social Work and communities at Western Sydney University. Her research interests are in the area of wellbeing and protection, children, Indigenous health and wellbeing, gender and I can't say that word, indigeneity, labour mobility, scheme impact and women and children, social policy and social protection. She's also the regional lead for the Pacific and acting associate dean for engagement at the School of Social Sciences. And also during 2024, Dr. Mio Sawabu has been leading a team of research staff from the University of the South Pacific on recent study into the impacts of labour mobility on children in the Pacific. Please join me in welcoming both presenters. So you work out who's going first.
Where do we click? Now we have to stop the clock. This was their time.
No, yes, of course, I am going to reset,
going
stop
up here.
that, absolutely, and reset it, okay. And I won't even start it till you start.
Thank you.
And the slides here.
So where do we?
Oh, there it is.
Great.
Okay. So, hello, Nisambulavanaka. Just first of all, just acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land, the Ngunnawal people, and also just acknowledging any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander in the room also. Yes, so I'm presenting today with Michael from UNICEF. The research team, you can see there was a collaboration between the University of the South Pacific and Western Sydney University. So we were looking at the impact of the Pacific Labour Mobility Scheme on the children left behind. And it was a 4-country study in Fiji, Samoa, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. We had to get this done quite quick. So ethics went through in February, and we did the data collection in March till April. And what we're presenting today are the findings from this research. So Michael will just give you a little bit of the background. I'll present on the findings, and then we'll talk a little bit about the outcomes, what has happened since then. Thank you.
Thanks, Latia. How do we go? Great, thank you. Thanks, Latia, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. I was talking with Alan this morning about UNICEF's partnership with the Hub, also looking at diaspora and their role in humanitarian response. So a bit about the background. For those of you familiar with the Pacific, you might know that Vanuatu is one of the countries most likely to be impacted by emergencies. People used to call them natural disasters, but I think we can safely say climate-induced disasters. During the aftermath of one of those cyclones, we noticed with government a really strong absence of working-aged adults in communities. So this morning we heard about the doubling of the rate of labour migration. If you think about really small population sizes, that's got a massive impact. So with the government of Vanuatu, they asked us to look at that and to understand what was happening, and quickly other governments also stepped into that as well. We intentionally wanted to work with Pacific academics, recognising that care arrangements are very cultural. We're wanting to look at language. We just heard about relationships and trust as well. So trying to get good information. So we're working with Pacific academics as part of this process. We think it's important that we factor in what are societal level changes into our development planning and programming. So UNICEF works in education, health, for example, working on parenting, child justice, and these big changes. We think we need to factor them in. We're not convinced that's been happening yet at a collective level across the Pacific. I would argue also the Australian government is a key donor to some of those sectors, so thinking about how this could be useful to them as well as the governments that we're working with as policy advice going forward.
So the methodology, what we had to do was to work closely with the Ministry of Labours in each of the governments, and also the ministry that was responsible for children. And one of the things we had to do was to initially identify communities that had the highest density of workers that were coming over to Australia and also to New Zealand. And so 3 communities were selected. So they were based on an urban community, a rural community, and the 3rd community was based on a community that had a high rate of child abuse that was happening. So we interviewed about 6 families in each country. There were 1 to 2 focus groups for young people and also for returned workers, so both in the urban and the rural communities. We also had stakeholders that we talked to, so these were all NGOs that worked closely with labor migration and also that worked closely with children. So Save the Children and ADRA were some of those stakeholders. And also we talked to some church leaders and community leaders just to see the impact of what was happening within the communities. So some of the initial findings, we all heard about the benefits of the labor mobility scheme. So families stated that it was a good thing, that it was bringing in money, that they could afford things that they weren't able to afford. In Samoa, they were saying that they could build the Palangi homes. So those were some of the, sorry, it's gone ahead, back. So those were some of the things that they were talking about that was very beneficial. The other thing that was found within the families and all the groups that we interviewed, a lot of them asked if they could all be part of the pre-departure program. Just for young children, they were talking about how they didn't understand why mom and dad were going abroad. They wanted to understand the whole context, what it meant, how they would communicate and things like that. Marital breakdown in all countries, that was evident, but not only for the workers coming across, but also for those staying in country. Communication with families, one of the things that was highlighted was that in the first 3 months, if they didn't hear from the workers that were here in Australia and New Zealand, then there tended to be a breakdown where the families would go to the ministries to ask, where is my husband or where's my wife? And so some of the communication breakdown would happen. Also for those in the rural communities, such as Vanuatu and Solomon Islands, because, we live, there's internet connection in most of the towns, but not necessarily in the rural communities, so communication was a bit harder. In terms of remittances, also there were just discussions about oftentimes there would be money not received by the person that it is supposed to go to. So in Vanuatu and Solomon Islands, where there's a lot of the rural communities, they have to find a middleman to take the money to their families. So the rural person, because there's no Western Union outlets in those rural communities. So that was some of the discrepancies or the gaps within remittances that were being sent. In terms of the children, there was a lot of discussion about how sad they were. They were happy when they get gifts and things like that, but they were sad in terms of not being able to speak to their parents on a daily basis, or not just being able to communicate on a daily basis. There's a lot of mental health impact and issues also. In terms of young men finding it difficult because they've had to help their mothers or parents to look after the family, and the care responsibilities being given to them. So in general, there's a shift in the care responsibilities. For young people also, there's, when we talk to the Ministry of Education in all the countries, there's been discussions about the school achievements and how the young people were struggling to make the grades, or, the school fees were being paid, but whether they attended school or not, there was another thing. Because there were disciplined behaviors. When the father is not there, the young man or the young child is more likely not to listen to the mother. So that was evident in all the 4 countries. Also, most of the return workers talked about how when they returned, there was a change in relationship or the closeness for the young person because they've been gone for quite a long period of time. And so the relationship has changed dramatically. Oops, I've gone back. Next. Okay, doesn't want to, okay, there it is. Okay, and for the child, so in all the 4 countries that we interviewed, there's mostly, as I said before, the shift in care responsibilities. So grandparents are often the ones looking after the children. Also, the older siblings within families are now responsible for looking after their younger siblings. And in some cases, some are under 18 also looking after the younger siblings. In most communities, there's no men. They can't form rugby teams. The rugby teams are here now and in New Zealand. But, you know, there's been change in gender roles throughout the 4 countries. And also in terms of, you know, they talk about things like farming. So, for example, in Samoa, one of the villages, they have a thing where if you are part of the labor mobility scheme, then you have to plant a plantation before you leave. But the women were talking about the maintaining that plantation. They can't do it. You know, the responsibility has shifted to them. Also the repair around the house and things like that. Mostly what men would do, they're doing it now. The shift in care responsibilities from rural to urban, because a lot of times the people that will look after them are in the urban areas, so children will have to be moved to their grandparents or uncles and aunties that live in the urban areas. Also, we found in some cases there were parents that were parenting from afar, so they'd be helping their children with homeworks and things like that because the parents that was left behind is not really good in mathematics or English or whatever, so it's the parent that's here or New Zealand that's helping with the child. In general, there's silent suffering with the caregivers, but there's no outlet for them or no place for them to actually talk about what's really going on within the communities.
Great, thanks, Lucia. So maybe just by way of linking, if we think about who's looking after the children, so that's normal and historical in the Pacific that children might be with extended family, but we heard about the rates of increases. So historically about 1 in 10 of all children in the Pacific would be with extended family. That's gone to 1 in 6 and 1 in 5, for example, in some communities, but it's about the way in which that's being planned. So one of the recommendations we're looking at is around whole family orientation, understanding what the scheme is. So this is not just with the men who typically go, but planning with the whole family, planning with the village, starting early. So this is not grandma finding out on Monday that she's got a group of kids to look after. So informed decision by the collective group. Sharing data, so talking with government, civil society partners, a lot of discussion about sharing data even across government, so people are able to monitor and look out for these families so they can get that support that we think is available, particularly through religious groups. Lucia talked about separation, and this was raised a lot, and I'll talk about some of the government deliberations, but around remittance and maintenance gaps. So we have, for example, men who are going, who need to pay maintenance, they've separated, or there's separation after departure, and how do we have sort of extraterritorial agreements so that money does come back in instances where there's separation. How can we think about including, and understand there's some good pilots which will be interesting to look at, including children, where that's possible to come across as part of the mobility. Thinking about caregivers themselves and their needs in the whole process. I talked about education. Lucia talked about women who are now being asked to take on agricultural work, responsible for the finances. There might be teenagers who are now doing the parenting, so looking at skills development across different areas for those who are left behind, for example. Parenting skills came up a lot as an area where we need to invest in terms of recommendations. These are really remote communities, so for those of you who haven't been, last week I was in the Solomon Islands, there's 900 islands, there's 12 social workers. So thinking about how would we monitor families, that's about working with churches and faith-based groups who have networks and structure out to communities. So really their role is critical. How do we work with them? And there are some good examples that we already have, for example, from the Solomon Islands. Is it this one? Nearly. There we go, great. So other recommendations, Lucia talked about counselling, support for children who are struggling. So we heard a lot about variation. Some Adults are leaving for short periods of time, coming back. Unfortunately, some are leaving for years. So those of you who know about children and attachment, think about children being without what might be one of their primary attachments for a period of 4 years. So this is unfortunately where, for example, men may not come back over the Christmas break, and we heard about differences between some of the schemes there. Care plans, and we've got good examples from Vanuatu where they're looking at the development of a care plan being a prerequisite for travelling. So being clear about who's looking after children. More agile social protection, so when it doesn't work out and a woman's been left with a large number of kids and a heavy burden of care and money is not coming back, how do we have social protection schemes that pick up on her so she's able to receive support rather than, for example, waiting another year for the new registration? We've got really struggling child protection systems on any given day across these countries. So how do we invest, given that we're really putting extended family care systems under incredible strain? They're normally carrying a lot of the protection and social protection. So generally, how do we invest? We talked about parenting skills, faith-based organisations, and monitoring, how we step up monitoring as well. And now we're going to go, we mentioned this is an initial study, and we really think what's come up is there's lots of areas we need to know more about. And I think we heard this morning about we could learn from other settings. So also thinking about what we know in terms of the impacts. And this morning, I think we heard that as well. So areas of further research.
Yeah, well, yes, there's so many that we discovered because the study we did is a small qualitative study. It was just about understanding the in-depth situation or realities within the families. And some of the things that we would like to recommend for further research is about looking at the social costs, the economic benefits of the schemes, and also just doing a really in-depth study across the countries of all those participating in the labour mobility scheme. Comparative study, the experiences of labour mobility in the countries. So as Michael was talking about that policy about the maintenance, that was a huge issue across all the countries because they could come across and not be responsible for the child. I think Tuvalu and Fiji is 2 countries only that has that policy, but most of the Pacific Island countries do not have that. So probably just a study looking into that. Samoa is the only country that has a cap on the number of workers, so they only sent 6,000 to New Zealand and 6,000 to Australia. All the other countries do not have a cap, so that's some of the things that maybe needs to be studied and the impact of that. Also, just the mitigating issues, as Michael has said, there's no social protection policies in each country except for Fiji. There's some there, but there's a need to look into what might be best for families that are traveling across. And then just the burden of care on women for all the countries, that was something that was discussed widely, that they're having to take on extra responsibilities, the grandparents, the gender roles and things like that. So any other study on that would be great.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to read this out, but Pacific governments, I think, are concerned about this issue. We brought a group of ministers for labour, ministers responsible for women, children and social protection, together with churches from across the Pacific. An example of an area where there's, if you like, a confluence of factors. Latia talked about the absence of men, so young boys growing up with less supervision, being able to be online, massively increasing availability of drugs in the Pacific at the moment. So there's a real concern that society is changing and it needs to be paid attention to. So they came together and drew up an outcome statement that we can share with you, and that is to be read as a companion document to the research that USP and Western Sydney University have pulled together.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Very an important piece of work, obviously. particularly around the impact of labour mobility and caregivers that are left behind, and something that obviously host countries need to really be very aware of. And thank you for the work and obviously the outcomes and the recommendations of this is something that is very serious that we should consider. I think it's taken for granted from when you're sitting back here in Australia and not realising the impact of what happens in the home country itself. So thank you for that. Look, we'll move on because we are running a little bit behind. So if I can call on now Elizabeth Collette is a Global Fellow at the Migration Policy Institute and serves on the Australia's Ministerial Advisory Council on Skilled Migration, where she chairs its expert subcommittee. With over 20 years experience in migration policy, she's consulted for various governments and non-government organisations. Previously was the Special Advisor at the International Organisation of Migration and founding director of MPI Europe. Holds a master's degree from Georgetown University and a law degree from Oxford University. Please join us. Thank you. I'll move these out of your way. Okay. Thank you. Set a time here for you as well.
Oh, exciting. I might try and wake everyone up with some jokes, but I'm not sure even I have the sense of humour at this point. So I am the chair of the expert subcommittee on skilled migration, which is attached to the Ministerial Advisory Council on Skilled Migration and an entity in desperate need of an acronym. I take all suggestions at the end of this panel. The subcommittee was established earlier this year by Minister Giles and his team with a view to connecting the expertise in Australia and beyond to the policy and decision-making processes that are themselves led by the Minister for Immigration and also the Minister for Home Affairs. The subcommittee has 8 members, and many of those names will be familiar to you: Dave Wilden, Anna Boucher, Chris Wright, Bettina Farbenbloom, Jane McAdam, Joanna Howe, Brendan Coates, an Oscars list of migration expertise in one room on a regular basis, designed to be responsive to questions asked by the Minister and by the Ministerial Advisory Council. I will start with some caveats, the first being this is very early days. I live in think tank world. This is not early days, 6 months in is halfway through a project typically, but in the worlds of academia and bureaucracy, I understand that this is extremely nascent. So we are still finding our feet as a subcommittee. It's also not necessarily the constellation that would have been designed. This has been also part of an expedient process of trying to, what can we create in the time allotted and what's available to us to bring expertise together rather than a proactively designed expert council. And if you look around the world, there's a huge range of expert advisory councils that are attached to governments. In Germany, in the Netherlands, in Sweden, they are quite formal affairs that have been institutionalized. In the Netherlands, institutionalized in legislation. You have the Migration Advisory Committee in the UK, which has a secretariat of 20 people, I'm given to understand, within government supporting its work. So you have these quite extensive expert advisory bodies. So here, this is a small sort of initial effort to really think about how do we better connect expertise with policymaking. It's happening now because there's a time of significant change, much of it instigated by the Parkinson Review and the ensuing migration strategy, giving Australia an opportunity to lead the way with thoughtful and sustainable migration reform. It's also coming at a time, as we've heard, of high political salience, with debate focused to a great and possibly disproportionate extent to net overseas migration figures as a blunt instrument of discussion, and questions of infrastructure, notably housing. And Australia is not alone here. Most of the developed economies, particularly in Europe and North America, are dealing with shifting inward migration numbers, infrastructure concerns, and even while they recognise looming skills shortages and looming demographic challenges, this has become a very tense and often bifurcated debate across the world. But often the fact that these are common challenges shared elsewhere around the world is under-considered within the Australian landscape, particularly how Australia might use some of the solutions identified elsewhere in adapting policy for change. And just in the last week, for me, it's been very notable that in the discussion about international students and policy shifts on international students, there's been very little reflection on the policy choices that have been made elsewhere, aside from Canada, which I know is both your nemesis and your love in migration policy terms. Changes in the UK, changes in France and Germany to encourage international students, the growing overall market and the demographic shifts that will mean this will be a growing sector in the future, and some contemplation of what that might mean for future programming in a context where the provision of international education domestically is at some point finite. So, there are opportunities, I think, to look a little further beyond, and part of this subcommittee's work will be to do some of that work. I also noticed that there's less focus, and that's really been brought into relief by the excellent presentation we've just heard, less focus on some of the broader issues that impinge on questions of migration policy domestically, the changing nature of mobility worldwide, the impacts of climate change and development prospects, the impacts of migration on those countries that people have departed from, on the one hand, and also then things like shifting demands of labour markets, whether that be the automation, green transition, the growing dichotomy between in situ and remote jobs, and perennial discussions about soft versus formal skills and how you identify and utilise soft skills. I would note, in my experience, people who have moved countries generally have some intrinsic soft skills which are valuable to the labour market but too often not incorporated. So many of these are discussed in different fora but rarely brought together. So part of the subcommittee's job is to focus on evidence and analysis that can support the design of forward-looking migration policy, but also hardwire means to assess the impact of those changes in policy to allow for thoughtful review. But to do this effectively, we need to be able to bring different perspectives to the table and to our work, whether that's deeper understanding of skills, training, education, whether it's regional or global geopolitics, mobility trends, or impacts at the community level, many of which we've just heard, and the perspectives and experiences of migrants and non-migrants at that level. The phrases whole of government and whole of society are often overused to the point of banality, and I've worked in the UN system, so I can absolutely confirm that as a speechwriter, you do a word search to check that you've put whole of government in any speech that you write. But it does remain meaningful in practical terms to ensure that we're not just looking at what the data tells us in the moment, but how to triangulate the different trade-offs in different policy portfolios that exist when trying to build a just, transparent, and sustainable migration system, and look forward again to then what the impacts of those will be for future trends. The Parkinson Review is an immense and necessary undertaking, and that through the migration strategy, it set an agenda for policy reform. But in my view, governments cannot and should not keep investing in large revolutions of this magnitude and be able to maintain public support. It creates a boom-bust policy cycle where we invest in a large review and then we leave things fallow for a decade, and then we invest in a large review, and so on. It forces governments to focus too much on fixing the mistakes of the past rather than creating a vision of the future, though I commend our esteemed chair for having set a vision at the same time as identifying some of the mistakes in the Multicultural Framework Review. There is a need to think about how to bring the extensive, though often fragmented expertise that supported that review to a consistent government venue, to offer policy insight and advice on a continuous basis, to mitigate risks and policy challenges as they arise, rather than through once-in-a-generation initiatives. And through that, embedding a feedback loop, assessing impact through data as well as community experience, understanding how the changing world beyond Australia will change dynamics of migration to Australia, and calibrating those policies as needed. And these should be the hallmarks of a modern immigration system. We can avoid the set the dials and sit back approach to migration policy that plagues so many countries. Having said all this and all this bombastic language, I'm not naive about the structural limitations that can often accompany an initiative such as this subcommittee and the inherent fragilities as it finds its feet. It is attached to Maxim and so has a limited focus on skilled migration. I've been gratified by the colleagues who sat on the subcommittee who have brought in a broader range of issues that sit alongside skilled migration, from migrant experiences in low-skilled labour to the opportunities that might be presented by expanding complementary pathways for refugees and humanitarian migrants. Immigration itself, in reality, is rarely so neat as to organise itself according to visa status. And yet it remains notable that in so many of our policy conversations, this is how our debate unfolds. So there is a need not just to ask how something might be reformed, but explore why it exists and how it came about. There is too often a focus on reviewing policy as it stands, rather questioning why it exists. And for me, a case in point is the recent review of the points test, which talked about doing the plumbing of how you might shift the points allocations here and there for different profiles to increase your skill level, without asking whether a system that has been in place for half a century, while the skyscrapers of other immigration policies have grown up around it, notably in temporary migration, might have affected the purpose and objective of the points test, and how to rethink that. So how do we step back and take that bigger picture, open up the bigger questions, particularly questions that governments are often too busy and too overwhelmed with the daily work that they have to undertake to really engage with. So in short, there's often a tendency to accept the premise of the question too often, rather than asking, is there a better question we should be asking? Practically speaking, there are three broad approaches to the subcommittee's work so far that we've found. One is support to ongoing policy processes. Members of the subcommittee have offered feedback to the different consultation papers that many of you will have seen over the last few months on the points test on regional migration. We've offered verbal feedback in meetings to ongoing policy processes, particularly the development of a multi-annual planning model on migration and the state migration plans. The subcommittee also hopes to be more responsive, responding to questions raised by the Minister and Maxim itself, but also other entities as appropriate, and try to be responsive in offering a quick answer if a quick answer is found, and a slightly longer answer if there isn't, if that's not available in the immediate term, but also setting a longer-term research agenda based on discussions within this group, identifying emerging challenges, untangling thorny issues. And I would hope that this group has the opportunity to set a more proactive research agenda that can help the Minister, Maxim, and the Department of Home Affairs look to the horizon. But to do this effectively and to realise that, we need to draw in expertise and build out a network. Any subcommittee working on issues of this breadth will undoubtedly be inadequate just in those 8 personalities to cover all of those issues. So one of the objectives of the subcommittee, and one of the reasons I'm so delighted Alan asked me here today, was really to try and draw in and engage all of you in that network of expertise. And I see Peter Morello here. He joined a meeting a few months ago to talk about his research on the points test that informed an ongoing conversation that eventually fed its way into the Ministerial Migration Roundtable, so we can start seeing those links build up as we go along, to help frame that research agenda, but also bring to the table pieces of research that you think will be relevant for those policy processes. I think we also need to contact other departments and bring different parts of that work together. Jobs and Skills Australia tend to join our meetings on a regular basis, and I hope to bring in more departments as we go. As you can only imagine, the bureaucratic and functional processes remain a work in progress. We're still figuring out how we are going to operate. But through discussions, and including with Minister Thistlethwaite, who was kind enough to flag them today in his own remarks, we've identified a few areas of work that might be of particular value, notably on regional migration, how new skilled migrants are supported in communities to build lives and stay. Building lives and staying long-term, I think, is a much nicer way of describing what is colloquially used in Canberra as retention in the regions. Perhaps it's about building lives. And where and how those skills might best be recognised and put to use. And I think I completely agree the importance of effective skills assessment and accreditation for the labour market is a key issue for the future. The multi-annual planning model on migration, working with the team in the Department of Home Affairs, pulling apart some of the early warning indicators that they've identified that might help future migration planning, and also thinking more about complementary pathways and how refugees might be supported to come through existing labour migration channels beyond and building upon the valuable pilot that's ongoing. We also have a number of general questions, and often it's quite difficult to constrain ourselves with the number of issues that we could take on as a subcommittee, but I think it's my job to try and shape that a little bit more. With just a couple of minutes to go, I'd just like to offer some final thoughts and draw on something I've heard Alan speak about in recent years in terms of the need for greater institution building on migration around the government institutions themselves. I have spent several decades working in that liminal space between academia and policy, otherwise known as working for a think tank. Notably the Migration Policy Institute, but also for others. I've worked directly with a range of policymakers and politicians from the senior to the junior and a range of stakeholders, all of those who care about having good, transparent policy that benefits migrants and society. In places like Washington, DC and Brussels, think tanks, external research institutes and networks of expertise are viewed as essential partners in policy development and innovation on migration. At the most basic level, they kick the tires of new policy ideas and ensure that policy processes have been turned over from every angle. They socialize new ideas, often making initially radical ideas seem like the best option available. They test the pros and cons, and when it works, that process leads to better policy design and a less bumpy policy implementation process. But even when it doesn't provide those answers, these venues bring policymakers into contact with valuable counterparts across government who may perceive their problems and propose solutions very differently and raise previously under-considered issues. They can inform those working in contiguous areas of policy about the constraints and convolutions of the world of immigration and open up a whole new set of migration nerds around the policy table. In the best circumstances, this was my experience, particularly in Brussels as Director of MPI Europe. The external discussion venues become safe spaces for policy interrogation and for airing policy concerns, and particularly at moments where there is high political salience and you need a safe space to be able to speak honestly without judgment. They're a valuable means to reduce the fragility and reactivity of policymaking, flagging potential issues early and setting out a range of ideas that might provide solutions. And outside voices can often make the points that it may be very difficult to make within government, however much some government officials may want to. I see here in Canberra that exists in the area of national security. I see that it exists in the area of international relations, but that ecosystem is well developed there, but it remains a work in progress in the area of immigration. There is no single institution that can solve this problem, and it will not happen overnight. But just as building capacity within government, as the Minister said, is a 10-year project, so the development of a robust cluster of expertise that does not always have to agree, that surrounds government and beyond the institutions, takes time to build and build the trust between government and other actors that allow those robust conversations to take place without breaking relationships. The expert committee that I am chairing in its earlier stages may provide one very modest means of incubating some of those thoughts and to offer some insight as to how best to provide responsive and valuable reflection on current policy concerns. It will ideally help nudge research expertise into the room, and I hope you will all take the opportunity to nudge your own research towards the subcommittee in that vein. There is a need for objective data and evidence and balanced debate, and this meeting here, I think, is a good example of how that can develop. And as a 3-day-old visitor to the ANU, I look forward to seeing how Alan helps create those institutions within Canberra that can help bolster that research. And I hope that will contribute also to the work of the expert subcommittee. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and congratulate you and the subcommittee that you, expert subcommittee that you chair, for the flexibility and the innovation that you have described that the subcommittee will take on. And I think particularly acknowledging the fact of trying to bringing together necessary links and connections in order for that to happen. So thank you very much again. Look, I think I can only take a couple of questions, right? I'll take one there, but I already have one submitted to me prior, and I must do that because I think it's more directed to Michael and to Latia, and I think it's, I don't know if you're here, and that is, let me have a look, where is he? Jade Anderson, are you here? Jade? Okay. Do you want me to ask your question, or do you want me to ask? Okay. So Jade is a PhD candidate, anthropology, College of Arts and Social Sciences, ANU, and her question is, how do you see temporary labour migration intersecting with changing household and community preparation for the responses to natural disasters in the Pacific? Yep.
This is a tricky question, but I think it's a great example of the extent to which we're thinking about labour mobility as intersecting with these other issues. So we just heard about some of the, societal level social impacts, and if we think about climate, if we take a country, for example, Fiji, where we have more than 40 communities that are scheduled for relocation due to climate change, right? So coastal inundation, and we're working with the government around how we may best move those communities. So thinking about which of the communities we're actually targeting to support for labour mobility and migration, are we using that as an opportunity, or are we saying let someone choose as they wish the locations without really looking at the criteria? So I think it's a really good question, because potentially we could be saying, look, who's most vulnerable in this country, who needs this opportunity? So we could be way more deliberate about it, thinking about those communities, because we've got increasingly good data across the Pacific about those communities that unfortunately are already moving and will have to move, for example.
Thank you. And the last question, quick question.
Thank you to Michael and to the Professor. There are three dimensions of both temporary and permanent visas that Australia has generally maintained for the last 40 or 50 years. I'm an old fella, so I remember some of this. Firstly, we've always tried to maintain the core family unit through migration. I know we're trying to do that a bit more with the PALM visa, but generally we don't. Secondly, we've always tried to ensure that there are reasonable skills-based pathways for temporary entrance to permanent migration. With the PALM visa, although we've introduced the lottery recently, generally we don't follow that principle. Thirdly, we have always counted permanent residence visas as part of our migration program. For the Pacific Engagement visa, we don't. For reasons I can't work out. Because we've largely ignored those three key principles of migration for so long with the PALM visa and the PEV visa, could that be part of the reason why we have such an extraordinarily high rate of asylum applications from PALM visa holders?
Who's doing this?
I'll try to answer that as best as I can, or just give, so, yes, so in general, a lot of the movements that's been happening with the PALM workers, because Australia and New Zealand defines them as unskilled workers, but the workers that are coming, we're losing teachers, we're losing nurses, we're losing the whole tourism industry is suffering as a result of that. In terms of the visa packages, I'm not quite sure what's going on there, but yeah, there has been talks with families. So for Samoa, it's much easier for them to migrate to New Zealand because there's that understanding within the government. But for, I know that, there's a lot of money being asked for visas from each country. So it cost about 1,000 something. Do you remember that? Yeah, for just a work visa to come to Australia. And for Vanuatu alone, there's about 5,000 workers coming every month. So that's costing the government, their workers a lot of money. But the loss in the job market in all these specific countries is quite huge also. The skills development, I know that some of them had talked about that there are opportunities within their workplaces that provide skills, but I think New Zealand they have something that's done by the government that's for workers. So there's examples of people who've come back to Vanuatu and other Pacific Islands and have started a business because of that skill. But then there's others coming to Australia that skill is not a thing, but it's dependent on the workplace that has hired you, if they give you that skill or not. I hope that's in some part
Might take.
talking to that.
Did you want to say something? No? Okay, just quickly.
Just really quickly, on the asylum, I don't know if that's because there's not the pathway, but people are trying to find one. Certainly around family unity, I think it'll be interesting to see how the pilot where children are coming, I talked about attachment and everything we now know in terms of the science of early childhood development and the importance of parents being around. There was discussion in the study about those differences. I talked about men who are not coming home over the breaks, going year after year after year. And that's in some of the outcome statements and recommendations, looking at family unity and family contact and increasing that. Yep.
And certainly a huge impact under the PALM scheme within the locally as well in those country towns. We found it was just yeah. Yeah. Negative, that's right. And the framework group actually picked up on some of that in our consultations there, which was very interesting. Okay, look, I'll have to stop there, and forgive me for going over time, but we were 5 people here, so I mean, and you will all agree it was worth it. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Haas. Thanks so much, Haas, and to the panel. Do we have the next panel here? Just wondering if it's okay if we start about 10 minutes late, if we start at 25 minutes past. Does anybody in the next panel have an objection to that? So decided. We start at 25 past, so please come in here, 25 past.